Snow fell thick and merciless over Michigan's Upper Peninsula, turning the pines into silent witnesses. Beneath that clean white skin, a Navy SEAL lay bound and half-buried, tape biting his mouth as the cold stole his breath. No one knew he was there until a 30-year-old female FBI agent on forced leave followed her K9 German Shepherd Atlas along the service road. Atlas froze, ears snapping forward, then dug like destiny had claws, and Claire heard it. A faint knock from under the snow. What they pull into the light will expose the hand behind it all and prove miracles can come on four paws. Where are you watching from? And please like and subscribe. Snow came down in soft sheets at first, almost gentle, like the sky was trying to apologize for winter. Up here in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, snow didn't just fall. It settled into the trees, into the quiet, into a person's bones if they let it. Claire Morgan didn't come north to be brave. She came north to be unseen. At 30, she was the kind of FBI agent people remembered. Athletic build, steady posture, shoulder-length dark brown hair that never quite stayed tucked behind her ears, and blue-gray eyes that looked calm, even when her mind wasn't. Lately, her mind hadn't been calm at all. A case downstate had ended wrong, one of those endings that didn't make the news but left a bruise on the inside of a person. She hadn't been suspended. She hadn't been fired. She'd been given the thing that felt worse, mandatory leave and a quiet, careful suggestion that she rest. Claire had heard the message underneath. Stop before you break. So she drove to the UP, to the family cabin she'd grown up visiting, where the roads were narrow and the pines were tall and nobody cared who you were as long as you didn't get stuck in a snowbank. The cabin sat back from the road like it was hiding too, cedar walls dark against the white, smoke curling from the chimney in a thin line. It was bright in that northern way. Pale sunlight, hard shadows, the world rinsed clean and cold. She should have felt peace. Instead, she felt the familiar pressure in her chest, like her body still expected sirens. She wasn't alone, though. Atlas rode in the back of her SUV, head lifted, ears alert, watching the world with the steady focus of a working dog even when off-duty was written on paper. Atlas was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, sable coat, black and brown, thick at the ruff, strong frame, upright ears like two sharp questions. His dark eyes held the kind of intelligence that made people lower their voices without knowing why. He was FBI K9, assigned to Claire as his handler, and he lived with her like family. Not a pet, not a tool, but a partner who had shared too many long nights and too many bad scenes to be treated casually. Claire's therapist called him a stabilizer. Claire called him the only breathing thing that didn't ask her to explain the parts she couldn't say out loud. That afternoon, she clipped on Atlas's lead and took the winter trail kit she always carried now, without thinking. A small folding shovel, a thermal blanket, headlamp, whistle, rescue cord, and a satellite messenger she'd bought after a case where cell towers might as well have been fairy tales. She told herself it was just a short walk, near the edge of the service road, where the trees opened enough that she could see the sky. No heroics, no deep woods, just air, just movement. The snow started to thicken as she walked, as if the forest had been waiting for her to step out before it began closing the door. Atlas padded beside her, calm and composed, his paws barely making sound on the fresh powder. Claire's boots crunched. The quiet was so complete it made her ears ring. In that silence her thoughts got loud. They tried to show her what she didn't want to see. A room, a file, a person she couldn't save. She swallowed hard and focused on what was in front of her, the clean line of the trail, the bright snow, the black trunks of pines. Atlas stopped once and sniffed at a buried branch, then moved on. He stopped again near a drift and stared at nothing, ears twitching. Claire let out a small breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You're not working right now?" she murmured, the way people talk to dogs when they're really talking to themselves. Atlas looked up at her, expression steady, then continued forward. He stopped a third time, more sharply. His body stiffened, tail lifting, not wagging. Claire felt it before she could name it, her own pulse rising, her skin tightening under her coat. "Atlas," she whispered, and her voice didn't have humor in it anymore. The dog's posture changed like a switch had been flipped. His ears locked forward. His nose lowered toward a patch of snow that looked exactly like every other patch. Smooth, untouched, innocent. He took one slow step, then another, as if approaching something fragile. Claire's breath came out in a thin cloud. She scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No deer. No birds. The forest felt held. A faint tap rose from beneath the snow, so soft it could have been a lie, and then everything inside Claire went still. Atlas exploded into motion. He lunged forward and began digging with frantic precision, front paws tearing through powder into packed layers beneath. Snow sprayed over Claire's boots, cold flecks against her pants. This wasn't playful digging. This was urgent, sharp, purposeful, like every second mattered. Claire crouched, heart hammering, and tried to hear what Atlas heard. The world narrowed to the sound of claws scraping, the hiss of snow, her own breath loud in her ears. "What is it?" she said, but her voice shook, and the answer didn't come in words. Atlas whined once, high, distressed, then dug harder. Claire dropped to her knees and pulled her folding shovel from the kit. Her fingers felt clumsy in gloves, but she forced them to work. She scooped snow away in short bursts. Under the top layer, the snow was darker, more compacted. Wrong. That wrongness made her stomach twist. She leaned closer, pressed her ear near the ground, and there it was again. Tap, tap, not wind, not branch. Something alive. Oh God, Claire breathed, and the forest did not respond. Atlas's paw struck something solid. He froze instantly, then shifted to careful, gentle scraping. Claire's throat tightened as a dark patch emerged. Fabric, not bark, not stone. Fabric. She scraped faster, snow burning her wrists with cold. A sleeve appeared, dark and stiff with frost. A shoulder. Then a face, male, pale as paper, lashes white with ice, jawline rough with stubble that suggested days without sleep, lips tinged blue. A strip of tape sat across his mouth, not perfectly sealed, but tight enough to silence. Atlas barked once, short and hard, then pressed his nose to the man's cheek. The man's chest moved, barely. He was alive. Claire's training tried to rise, crisp and procedural, but it collided with a wave of human horror. "Hey, hey," she said, voice sharp now, all business and fear. She reached for the tape, fingers trembling, and peeled it back slowly. The skin beneath was raw. The man sucked in air like it was the first breath of his life, coughing weakly, eyes fluttering open in confusion. His gaze slid to Claire's face, then to Atlas. Something like relief cracked through the fog in his eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice came out broken, more rasp than word. "Help," he managed. Claire swallowed the ache in her throat. "You're going to get it," she said, firm the way she'd wished someone had been firm for her on her worst day. "Stay with me." As she tucked the thermal blanket around his shoulders, her hand brushed the edge of a patch on his gear. Navy SEAL. The letters hit her like a cold splash. Claire didn't chase questions yet. She did what she could do right now. She wrapped him tighter, checked his breathing, and pulled out her satellite messenger. Her thumbs were steady, even though her chest was not. She sent an emergency signal with the coordinates, then blew the whistle twice, just in case sound carried farther than she thought. Atlas suddenly lifted his head and stared into the trees, muscles taut again. Not relief? Alarm? Claire followed his gaze. Snow drifted between trunks, thickening, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they formed. For a heartbeat, she saw nothing. Then, far beyond the service road, a shape stood where the white met the dark. A person, too still, too far to make out details. Watching? Claire's spine went rigid. Atlas gave a low growl that vibrated through the quiet. The figure did not run. It didn't wave. It simply turned, slipped behind the pines, and vanished, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Above them, snow kept falling, soft, merciless, beautiful. And somewhere in those trees, someone had just seen the impossible come back to life. The snow didn't stop just because help was coming. It kept falling like the forest had decided to bury the day itself. When the first snowmobile lights cut through the trees, Claire felt a sharp rush of relief. Then a colder feeling slid in underneath it. Relief meant witnesses. Witnesses meant whoever had watched them from the tree line now knew the impossible had survived. Atlas stayed glued to Ethan's side while the rescue crew worked, his sable coat already crusted with ice along his shoulders, ears tracking every sound. He didn't bark, he didn't wag, he hovered like a guard posted at the edge of a cliff. Ethan looked worse up close. He was tall, even half buried, with a strong frame that had been stolen by cold. His cheeks were hollow, his stubble dark against skin gone gray-blue. The tape had left raw marks at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes opened and closed like a dying flashlight. When they lifted him onto the rescue sled, his hand twitched as if searching for something he'd lost. Claire thought of the shadow in the trees and felt her stomach knot. The ride out was short in miles, long in seconds. The snowmobile engine roared, shaking the world, and wind slapped Claire's face with needles. Atlas pressed close to her knee on the sled, body tense, eyes scanning left and right, as if danger could leap out of the whiteness. Claire kept one gloved hand on Ethan's shoulder through the thermal wrap, feeling the faint rise of his breath. She told herself she was doing this as a citizen who found a man in trouble. Not as FBI, not as someone who couldn't stop chasing the next thread. But her brain didn't believe her. It kept replaying the same question in different costumes. Who buries a living person in the snow? The nearest emergency room was small, the kind of rural hospital that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, with fluorescent lights too bright for tired eyes. The doors opened and closed with a wheeze. Nurses moved fast, their faces practiced, their hands sure. A woman in navy scrubs stepped forward and took command with quiet authority. Her name tag read, Dr. Maya Kincaid. She was in her late 30s, medium height, dark skin, warm against the harsh light, hair pulled into a tight bun that said she didn't waste time on anything that didn't matter. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. Hypothermia, she said immediately, voice clipped but steady. We warm him slowly. No hero warming. Claire nodded, swallowing the urge to explain everything at once. She watched as they stripped off frozen layers, checked pulse and pupils, started warm fluids. Dr. Kincaid's hands were quick, confident, and careful in the exact way that said she'd seen too many people lose time. When Claire said the words bound and taped, the doctor's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes tightened. That's not a fall, she said quietly, like she didn't want the walls to hear. Atlas tried to follow the gurney into the trauma bay. A security guard stepped in front of him, uncertain. Atlas's ears pinned forward, and his lips lifted just enough to show he could become a weapon, if pushed. Claire met the guard's eyes and softened her voice. He's FBI K9, she said. He's trained. He stays with me. Atlas leaned into her leg, still vibrating with purpose, and the guard, wisely, chose distance over pride. Then local law arrived, and the air in the hallway changed. Sheriff Marin Holt walked in with snow on her shoulders and authority in her stride. She was in her mid-40s, tall and rangy, with wind-reddened cheeks and a pale blonde braid tucked under her hat. Her eyes were a winter blue that could look warm to a child and ruthless to a liar. She didn't carry herself like someone who needed to prove anything. She carried herself like the one who had already survived it. "I'm Holt," she said, offering Claire a firm nod instead of a handshake, as if hands were for friends, not statements. "You're the one who found him." Claire gave her name, nothing more, and Holt didn't press. Holt took Claire's account in plain, careful questions: where, when, what she heard, what she saw, what tools she used. Claire mentioned the shallow cavity, the bindings, the tape, the figure in the trees. At that last part, Holt's jaw tightened slightly, a small tell in an otherwise controlled face. "Any details?" Holt asked. "Too far," Claire admitted. "Just still. Watching?" Holt looked down the hall toward the trauma bay doors. "If someone watched, they knew he was alive," she said. "And if they wanted him dead, they don't stop wanting it because an ambulance showed up." A sudden metallic clack, like a cart slamming a doorframe, rang out from the supply corridor, and Atlas snapped his head so fast the motion blurred, his growl rising from deep in his chest before anyone else even turned. Claire's skin prickled. The hallway had been loud with hospital noise, but that sound was different. Wrong. Holt followed Atlas's stare, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" she asked, not to Claire, almost to the dog. A man stepped out of the supply corridor, pushing a wheeled cart stacked with boxes. He wore a cheap gray beanie and a reflective vest like a dozen contractors in winter. He was young, mid-20s maybe, thin build, patchy beard, eyes that didn't quite meet anyone's for more than a blink. He tried to smile, but it didn't land. "Sorry," he said, voice light. "Late delivery." Holt lifted a hand. "Name, company." The man rattled off a local name and pointed at his vest logo. Holt didn't move. Dr. Kincaid had stepped into the hall again, and her eyes locked onto the cart. "We didn't request meds tonight," she said flatly. "And those boxes aren't labeled." The man's smile cracked. Atlas took one step forward, not pulling, just placing himself like a living question mark between Claire and the cart. His nose flared. A low whine slipped out. Urgent. Warning. Claire felt a cold certainty settle in. This wasn't about gauze. This was about access. "Open the boxes," Holt ordered. The man hesitated, just long enough. Holt's deputy, a stocky woman with short hair and eyes like flint, moved in fast and snapped the top box open. Inside were supplies, yes, but tucked beneath them was a sealed pouch without hospital markings and a hard plastic case meant for needles. The contractor's shoulders sagged, like he'd been waiting for the moment his luck ran out. When Holt's deputy grabbed his arm, he jerked, trying to twist away, but Holt pinned him with practiced force. "You picked the wrong night," Holt said, low and cold. Dr. Kincaid stared at the open box as if it had insulted her personally. "He would have killed him?" she whispered, not as a question. Holt didn't look up. "Or made it look like he died on the table," she replied. Claire's mouth felt dry. She looked at Atlas, who had stopped growling but hadn't relaxed. The dog's eyes were locked on the contractor with a kind of disgust that felt almost human. Claire's phone buzzed in her pocket. Unknown number. She answered before she could stop herself because waiting felt like weakness, and she'd already lived through what hesitation cost. A voice, low and calm, spoke as if it had all the time in the world. "You've seen too much," it said. Then the line went dead. For a second, all Claire could hear was her own heartbeat, loud and stupid in her ears. Holt's deputy returned from the nurse's station, holding a printout, face tight. "Sheriff," she said, "service road cameras near the forest. Gone. Not storm damage. Wiped. The system shows manual deletion." Holt stared at the paper like it was a death certificate. Then she looked up at Claire, and there was no softness left in her winter blue eyes. "This wasn't a blizzard accident," she said. "This was a burial." Morning in a small northern hospital didn't feel like morning anywhere else. The light came in pale and careful, as if even the sun was afraid to make noise. Claire sat on a plastic chair that was too hard and too bright, watching the trauma bay doors like they might suddenly confess. Atlas lay at her feet, still in full alert mode, head on his paws but eyes open, tracking every footstep in the hallway. His sable coat looked darker under fluorescent lights, and the tips of his ears twitched at each new sound, as if he were tuning the building itself. Ethan was alive, but alive in that fragile, borrowed way. Dr. Maya Kincaid, steady hands, tight bun, eyes sharp enough to slice through excuses, had moved him from the rush of trauma into a monitored room and warned everyone about the dangerous middle stage of hypothermia. "Don't celebrate yet," she'd said. "The body likes to surprise you after cold." Ethan's breathing was still shallow. His skin had regained a little color, but not enough to look normal. He drifted in and out, jaw tight, even in sleep, like his body still remembered being buried and refused to unclench. Sheriff Maren Holt didn't waste time. She looked like the kind of woman Winter couldn't bully. Tall, rangy, pale blonde braid, wind-burned cheeks, and eyes the color of lake ice. She had already ordered her deputy to log every visitor, every staff entry, every delivery schedule. "If someone tried to walk in here wearing a vest and a smile," she said, "they can try again wearing something else." Her deputy, short-haired, stocky, all muscle and focus, nodded once and went back to the desk like a door that knew how to lock itself. By mid-morning, Holt returned with someone new at her side, a state investigator named Naomi Vance. Naomi was in her early 40s, average height, sharp jawline, and dark auburn hair cut into a practical bob that framed a face that didn't offer warmth for free. She wore a heavy winter coat over plain clothes and carried a battered notebook like it was an extension of her hand. Her eyes were the kind that noticed tiny things: mud on a boot, a pause in a sentence, a lie trying to dress itself up as truth. She gave Claire a quick look, the way people look at a tool they've never used before. Not rude. Evaluating. Naomi spread paperwork across the nurse's station counter, turning it into a makeshift command table. "Service road cameras wiped," she said, tapping the printout. "Not storm, not random. Manual deletion." Holt exhaled through her nose. "So we're not dealing with a drunk hunter and an accident." "No," Naomi said. "We're dealing with someone who planned for snow to do their cleanup." Claire kept her hands on her knees, holding herself still. "I can give you the coordinates," she said, "and my notes, and what I saw." She didn't say FBI, not yet. She didn't reach for power. She just offered facts the way you offer a blanket to someone shivering. Holt nodded. Naomi's pen moved fast. They built the first picture out of boring things, logs and receipts and routes. Naomi requested the winter maintenance ledger for the service road and the list of contractors authorized to work in that sector. Holt pulled dispatch records from the morning Ethan was found, plus the list of snowmobile teams staged at the ranger station. The more paper appeared, the more the story stopped looking like a mystery and started looking like a machine. Machines had operators. Operators left fingerprints, even when they wore gloves. Atlas lifted his head when Naomi set a plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside was the reflective vest the fake contractor had worn, along with a cheap gray beanie and a folded sheet of paperwork that looked official if you didn't stare too hard. Atlas sniffed once, then sneezed, then whined softly as if the smell offended him. Claire watched his body language with the calm focus of a handler. "He's picking up chemical residue," she said quietly. "Something sharp, not hospital disinfectant." Naomi's eyes flicked to Claire. "He's trained to distinguish?" "Yes," Claire said, "but he can be wrong sometimes. He flagged a scent earlier by the ambulance bay that turned out to be spilled fuel. This isn't that." Naomi nodded, accepting the nuance. It made Atlas feel real, brilliant, but not magic. The monitor in Ethan's room suddenly chirped into a harsh, rapid alarm, and the sound sliced through the hallway like a blade, every conversation freezing mid-breath. Claire was on her feet before her brain caught up. Atlas rose too, muscles tight. Through the small window in the door, Ethan's body jerked as if he were falling in his sleep. Dr. Kincaid rushed in, calm like a storm contained. Seconds later, the alarm slowed. A nurse exhaled, shaky. Dr. Kincaid stepped out and looked at Claire. "Nightmares," she said. "His body is still fighting the snow. He's stable." Claire's knees threatened to soften, and she hated how close fear lived inside her lately. Holt watched her carefully, then said, quieter than before, "This is what they wanted, to leave him alive long enough to be found dead later." When Ethan finally woke for real, it was only for minutes. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening when he saw Atlas. Something eased in his face. He tried to sit up and failed, jaw grinding with pain. Dr. Kincaid pushed him back gently. "Short sentences," she warned. Ethan swallowed hard. His voice came out rough. "I wasn't lost?" Holt leaned in. Naomi's pen hovered. Claire stayed back like she didn't deserve to take up air. Ethan's gaze moved to Holt, then Naomi, measuring who could hold weight. "Leave," he rasped. "Sensitive, not public." Naomi's expression didn't soften, but her tone did. "We can work with that. We just need a direction." Ethan licked cracked lips. "I separated. Couldn't trust comms. Someone was inside." The word inside landed like a stone. "I had evidence," he whispered. "Encrypted. Split key." Holt frowned. "Where's the device?" Ethan's eyes flicked shut, then open again. "Not on me. If I carried it, they'd have it. I was going to hand it off." He coughed. The sound hurt to hear. "They caught me, buried me, so snow would erase the rest." Naomi's notebook filled with arrows and names and boxes. "So we follow the outside layers," she said. "Transport, access, contractors, winter supply chain." Holt nodded. "We start with who had legal reason to be on that road." Naomi slid a sheet toward Holt, an authorization list with one company name circled. Not a person, a shell, a logo. Clean and simple, like it had been designed to look harmless. Claire stared at it and felt something in her chest tighten. Not recognition yet, but the shape of a pattern. She could almost hear her old case whispering, the one that had broken her confidence. Paper, money, people pretending to be normal. Holt's phone buzzed. She stepped away to answer. When she came back, her face looked carved from ice. "FBI field office called," she said. "They received our report through official channels." Her eyes met Claire's. "They want you on the coordination line, not as a hero, as support." Claire's throat went dry. Support was still a doorway back into danger. Holt set her phone down and tapped the circled logo again. "We don't have the boss yet," she said, "but we've got their mask." Claire watched Atlas. He was staring toward the hospital entrance, ears forward, as if he could hear trouble arriving from miles away. Claire understood that feeling. She looked at the logo and realized the truth was no longer buried. It was breathing, and it was about to wake up angry. Claire didn't sleep much after the call from the field office, not because she was excited, because her body didn't trust quiet anymore. The official instruction had come through clean and formal, like a stamp on paper could calm what snow had done to the human heart. She was now support on a joint coordination line, limited scope, documented steps, no cowboy moves. It should have felt safer. Instead, it felt like a door clicking open behind her, letting the old case shadows drift back in. Sheriff Maren Holt ran her county like someone who knew winter could kill you for being careless. She kept her braid tucked under a knit cap, cheeks raw from wind, eyes steady as ice. Naomi Vance, the state investigator, was already building a wall of timelines on a whiteboard in the hospital's cramped conference room. She wrote with quick, sharp strokes, auburn bob swinging slightly when she leaned in, her mouth set, like a woman who'd learned long ago that criminals count on fatigue. Between them sat the Shell Company logo, circled in red, looking harmless enough to be a coffee shop, until you remembered a man had been buried under snow because of it. A new face arrived before noon, introduced by Holt with the kind of respect she didn't hand out freely. "This is Agent Lena Park," she said. Lena was FBI, field office, mid-30s, petite but upright, with sleek black hair cut to her jaw and a calm expression that made her seem almost gentle until you looked closer at her eyes. Those eyes held the sharpness of someone who'd spent years listening to lies and learning their rhythm. She wore a dark winter coat and plain gloves, nothing flashy, but her presence carried that federal weight, the sense that paperwork could become handcuffs if you stacked it right. "Claire," Lena said, nodding once. No speech, no drama, just a quiet acknowledgement that Claire was being pulled back into the world she'd tried to step away from. Atlas watched Lena carefully, ears forward, then looked back to Claire as if asking, "Is she ours?" Claire rested 2 fingers on his collar. "She's with us," she murmured, though she wasn't sure anyone was fully with anyone in a case like this. The plan wasn't to charge into the woods. The plan was to pull threads. Naomi traced routes, winter supply runs, fuel deliveries, maintenance schedules, access points. Holt mapped which roads her deputies could actually reach in deep snow. Lena coordinated subpoenas and phone data requests with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew that the cleanest arrest begins with boring paperwork. Claire provided what she could, her coordinates from the satellite messenger, her timeline, the description of the watcher in the trees, and the little behavioral tells that didn't fit. How the fake contractor's smile didn't land. How his eyes had darted to Ethan's door as if the mission was the man, not the hospital. Ethan remained in a monitored room, still too weak to stand, still too stubborn to fully rest. When Dr. Kincaid allowed it, he sat upright for a few minutes, shoulders tense, jaw clenched as if he could grit his way back to strength. Up close, he looked like a man carved by hard training and harder memories, broad shoulders, strong hands, and that dark stubble shadowing a face that had learned to stay unreadable. But his eyes gave him away. They carried the haunted alertness of someone who had been conscious under snow, hearing the world move above him and knowing it might never stop to listen. He spoke in fragments, conserving oxygen like it was currency. "They used a route," he rasped, voice still rough. "Shortcut, across the lake." Holt frowned. "The frozen lake?" Ethan nodded once, then winced, like even nodding cost him. "They wanted it to look natural. If I disappeared out there, snow covers everything." Naomi's pen moved. Lena's gaze sharpened. Claire felt a cold line run down her spine. A lake was a perfect place to erase people. It wasn't just water. It was a mouth. By late afternoon, Naomi's work hit a nerve. The Shell Company had been authorized on a county maintenance list through a subcontractor. Legal enough to pass first glance, dirty enough to hide what it really moved. The name on the paperwork wasn't the kingpin. It was a mask. But masks still had seams. Naomi found one, a warehouse lease tied to an out-of-town holding group and a set of winter fuel invoices that didn't match the mileage. "Someone's moving weight," she said, tapping the numbers. "Not snowplows." Holt's deputy brought in a new piece, a recovered snippet from a backup server, one camera angle the wipe didn't catch. Grainy. Night. A vehicle near the service road, plates obscured. But on the door, the same clean logo. That was enough for a controlled step, not a raid, a look, a drive-by verification to match the warehouse location Naomi identified, with Holt's units ready, Lena on the coordination channel, and Claire there as support, eyes and notes, not command. Ethan insisted on coming, which was ridiculous, and everyone told him so. but he argued with a tired half-smile that somehow carried steel. "If they use the lake, I can tell you where," he said. "I don't have to run, I just have to point." Dr. Kincaid hated it, but she hated losing people more. She signed off on a short transport with strict limits and a medic in the vehicle. The drive out felt like crossing into a painting that had teeth. Snow glittered under fading light. Pines stood like silent witnesses. The lake lay ahead, wide and pale, reflecting the sky with that holy brightness that makes people forget it can kill. Claire's breath fogged the windshield. Atlas sat rigid in the back, watching the tree line the way a soldier watches a ridge. They reached the access point Ethan described, a narrow turnoff, tire marks half filled by fresh snow. The world was quiet enough to make Claire's heartbeat sound loud. Holt's vehicles stayed back. Lena spoke softly into her radio, calm as prayer. Naomi stepped out to photograph tracks. Claire followed, boots crunching, hand instinctively near Atlas's harness. The ice made a sound like a gunshot, sharp, cracking, immediate, and the surface beneath Claire's foot shivered, a spiderweb of fractures flashing white under the snow. Atlas lunged without hesitation, teeth catching the strap of Claire's coat, yanking her backward with a force that stole her breath. Claire stumbled hard onto solid ground as the ice at the edge gave a low, hungry groan. Water seeped up through the cracks, dark as spilled ink. For one frozen second, Claire stared at the place her foot had been and understood how close she'd come to vanishing without a scream. Ethan, standing with help near the vehicle, saw it too. His face tightened. "That's the trap," he whispered. "They led me right here. Night, snow, thin edge. One step, and I'm gone." Holt's eyes flared with anger so bright it looked like heat. "They didn't need a gun," she said. "They just needed winter." They pulled back immediately. No heroics, no extra steps. Lena's voice cut through the radio, measured and hard. "We have probable cause for the warehouse tie," she said. "We document, we build, we don't rush." Naomi nodded, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Holt's deputy marked the tire tracks. Atlas paced once, then stopped, ears locked on the distant tree line like he could feel eyes there again. Back at the command center, the case accelerated the way storms do. Quiet, then suddenly everywhere. Lena obtained emergency authorization for financial holds. Naomi pushed warrants for the warehouse lease and subcontractor records. Holt secured the lake access as a crime scene. And in the middle of it, Ethan produced the one thing everyone had been waiting for: a location hint to where the encrypted device had been stashed, separate from him, protected by distance and paranoia. "Split key," he reminded them, voice rough but steady. "They can't open it without the rest." That night, as paperwork turned into action, a message arrived through an intermediary. No return number, no signature, just a simple line delivered like a knife laid on a table. "Winter is long." Lena read it once and didn't blink. Holt's jaw set. Naomi's pen stopped for the first time all day. Claire looked down at Atlas, who was watching the door as if he expected the cold itself to walk in. Somewhere out there, the man behind the mask had finally noticed her name, and he was reminding them all of the same truth. The season wasn't over. 3 years didn't pass like a page turning. They passed like snowmelt, slow, stubborn, and messy, revealing what winter had tried to hide. After the lake trap and the message, "Winter is long," the case didn't end. It widened. It became paperwork stacked on paperwork, interviews piled onto interviews, and late nights where the glow of a monitor felt like the only sunrise anyone got. Agent Lena Park stayed steady at the center of the coordination line. Small frame, sharp eyes, voice calm even when the room around her frayed. Sheriff Maren Holt did what she always did. She held her county like it mattered, because it did. Naomi Vance built timelines like a carpenter builds stairs, step by step, so no one could claim they fell by accident. And Claire. Claire did the hardest job of all. She learned to exist inside a case without letting it swallow her whole again. Victor Hale never showed his face at first. He didn't need to. He was the kind of man who lived behind signatures and consulting fees, the kind of man whose hands stayed clean because other people did the lifting. But he had made one mistake. He had underestimated the simplest force in the world. Proof. Ethan's proof. The encrypted device he'd protected by splitting the key, by refusing to trust channels that could be compromised. It wasn't a single magic file. It was a map, names, dates, payments, routes, and the quiet logic of money moving where it shouldn't. Money always told the truth eventually, even when people didn't. The federal case grew teeth the way winter grows ice. Accounts were frozen in waves. Properties were seized. Shell companies folded like paper in a storm. Lower-level men tried to run, then tried to bargain. Some gave testimony because they were scared. Some because they were tired. Some because, deep down, they didn't want to die for Victor Hale's comfort. RICO wasn't one dramatic door kick. It was pressure, slow and constant, until even strong walls cracked. Claire changed too. She transferred units, not to escape, but to survive. She needed a place where her mind could heal without being asked to sprint every day. Her therapist, an older woman with silver hair and warm eyes, named Dr. Evelyn Shaw, told her something that irritated Claire at first. Your courage is not measured by how much pain you can carry, it's measured by what you refuse to carry alone. Dr. Shaw spoke softly, like prayer, but she didn't let Claire dodge. The sessions weren't cinematic. They were plain. They were hard. They were holy in the quietest way. Ethan recovered in stages. Physical therapy rebuilt muscle and balance, but it didn't rebuild trust. That took longer. Some nights he still woke with the ghost feeling of weight on his chest, like snow had found him again. He left the Navy with honors and a body that looked strong but carried invisible costs. When he shaved, the scar at his mouth corner, where tape had bitten skin, remained a thin, pale line, a reminder that silence had been forced on him, and he had survived it anyway. He didn't become a man who talked too much after that. He became a man who chose words carefully, like each one was a tool. Through all of it, Claire and Ethan didn't rush into romance like a movie that wanted applause. They moved like real people do after trauma, two cautious souls learning where the edges were. They had coffee in hospital cafeterias. They sat in parked cars while the heater hummed, and neither of them spoke. They laughed at dumb things. An overly dramatic weather alert, a vending machine that stole Ethan's dollar, Holt's deputy rolling her eyes so hard it looked like a workout. Humor didn't erase grief. It just gave it a chair to rest in for a moment. Atlas changed the most visibly. At 5, he had been a blade, quick, powerful, tireless. At 8, his muzzle began to gray at the edges, as if time was dusting him with ash. His joints ached in deep cold. Some mornings he rose slower, stretching longer, blinking like the day was asking too much. Claire bought him a heated pad and a thick winter coat, and she pretended she didn't notice how it hurt to need those things. But Atlas still had his gift. His instincts remained sharp, not frantic, sharp like a compass needle that never lies. Even when his body slowed, his attention didn't. He watched doors. He listened to tone. He could sense the difference between a harmless stranger and a man who wanted to hurt. One evening, in the quiet of Claire's kitchen, Atlas suddenly lifted his head and stared at the front window, perfectly still, while a single car's headlight swept across the snow outside like a slow, searching blade, and then the light cut out. Claire froze with a dish towel in her hands, heart tightening. Ethan, sitting at the table, stopped mid-sip of coffee. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the phone buzzed. Not an unknown number this time. Holt. Claire answered, voice steady by sheer will. They just picked up a tail vehicle near your road, Holt said. We're on it. Stay inside. Ethan's jaw flexed. Atlas let out one low, warning growl and placed himself between Claire and the window like a living shield. It turned out to be one of Victor Hale's remaining loyalists, desperate and stupid, trying to intimidate a witness who hadn't broken. Holt's deputy made the stop 2 miles down the road. No gunfire, no chase scene, just a man pulled over under a streetlight, his bravado shrinking when he realized the world had shifted against him. It was a small moment in the middle of a giant case, but it mattered. It proved the danger was real, and also that Claire wasn't alone anymore. By the 3rd year, the courtroom became the battlefield. Victor Hale finally appeared in person, older than his photos, expensive suit hanging perfectly, hair silvered at the temples, face smooth in the way power can make a face smooth. He wasn't handsome. He was polished. His eyes were pale and empty, like he'd spent a lifetime looking past people rather than at them. When he walked into the courtroom, the air changed, not because he was impressive, but because everyone felt the weight of what he'd done without ever getting his hands dirty. The evidence didn't care about his polish, financial trails, warehouse leases, testimony from flipped operators, and Ethan's encrypted map, opened only when the split key was finally complete, clicked into place like the last bolt on a door. Victor Hale was convicted, not because someone got lucky, because people refused to stop. Afterward, life didn't become perfect. It became possible. Ethan and Claire kept choosing ordinary days, grocery lists, therapy appointments, quiet walks. One spring afternoon, snow finally gone, the world soft and green, Ethan took Claire to the cabin porch where this story had begun. He didn't kneel dramatically. He didn't give a speech meant for cameras. He just held out a simple ring, his hands steady, eyes honest. "I don't want a life built on fear," he said. "I want one built on the way you showed up anyway." Claire's throat tightened. She laughed once, shaky and real. "That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard," she whispered, and Ethan's mouth twitched into that rare smile that meant safety. "Good," he said, "because we're not a movie." Atlas padded over, slower now, and rested his heavy head on Claire's hand, as if signing a promise with the weight of his trust. Claire looked down at him, and tears came, warm, quiet, grateful. 3 years hadn't been silent, but here, at last, something inside her was. The town they chose for the wedding sat 1 county over, far enough from the forest to let the air feel new. It had a small main street with old brick buildings, a diner that still served pie, like it mattered, and a little white chapel that looked like it had been standing there since before most people could remember their own beginnings. Claire wanted that distance, not because she was running from the past, but because she refused to let the past stand at the altar with her. Still, she didn't pretend the story began somewhere prettier. The morning of the wedding, before hair and vows and guests, she asked Ethan to come with her to the lake access point, just for a minute. Holt arranged it quietly, the way she handled everything that mattered. No crowd, no speeches, no news vans. Naomi Vance came too, not as an investigator, but as a witness, her auburn bob tucked under a knit cap, notebook left behind for once. Dr. Maya Kincaid joined them in a thick winter coat, her dark skin flushed with cold, hair pulled into a practical bun, eyes softer than Claire had ever seen them in the hospital. They stood in the pale light, like 3 women who had watched winter try to steal something and fail. The lake was calm that morning, bright and wide, reflecting the sky like polished glass. It looked innocent now, like it had never cracked under a boot. Claire hated how beautiful danger could be. Ethan stood beside her, taller than he used to feel in her memory. Stronger now, but still carrying a quiet stiffness in his shoulders, the kind that comes from knowing how close the world can bring you to the edge without warning. His face was clean-shaven today, but the faint scar at the corner of his mouth remained, a thin, pale line that truth refused to erase. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. "I'm here." I stayed. Atlas arrived last, stepping carefully out of the vehicle with a slow dignity that made Claire's chest tighten. At 8, He wasn't the Blade he once was. His muzzle had gone gray at the edges, his gait a touch stiff, his joints complaining in the cold. Holt's deputy helped him down with gentle hands, respectful like she was helping an old warrior. Atlas's sable coat still looked rich and strong, black and brown fur thick around his neck, but his eyes, those dark, steady eyes, were older now, carrying a patience that came only from surviving many storms. Claire knelt and pressed her forehead to his for a moment. "We're okay," she whispered. "We made it." Atlas exhaled warmly against her cheek, as if he understood the word made it better than most people ever could. They didn't step onto the ice. They stayed on solid ground, where the old tire marks had long since vanished and the snow looked untouched again. Claire held a small ribbon in her gloved hand, plain, white, and tied it to the nearest pine branch. Not as a superstition, as a thank you. Holt watched, her winter blue eyes blinking slower than usual, like she was holding back something personal. Naomi stood with her hands in her pockets, shoulders squared, the kind of woman who never cried in public but still believed in meaning. Dr. Kincaid clasped her hands together as if she were praying, though she never would have called it that. Claire looked out at the lake and felt the old fear rise, then settle. It didn't own her anymore. She had learned something in 3 years of courtrooms and therapy and ordinary mornings. Fear could ride in the passenger seat, but it didn't get to drive. She turned to Ethan. "Ready?" she asked, trying to make her voice light. Ethan's mouth curved into a small smile. "As long as you promise the vows are shorter than the federal paperwork," he said. Claire let out a laugh that surprised her with how free it sounded. Even Holt's deputy snorted softly, like the joke had cracked a window in her armor. Back in town, the chapel filled slowly with people who had earned their seats. Holt arrived in a simple dress coat, posture still official, even without a badge on display. Naomi wore dark slacks and a neat blouse, hair smooth, face unreadable except for the tiny warmth in her eyes when she looked at Claire. Dr. Kincaid came in a soft sweater dress and practical boots, her expression calm, like a woman who'd seen miracles and refused to cheapen them with dramatics. A new person appeared at the doorway, Ethan's older sister, Grace Cole. She was in her early 40s, tall and elegant with light brown hair swept into a loose twist, skin fair and freckled in a way that hinted at summers spent outdoors. Her eyes were kind but tired, the eyes of someone who had spent years waiting for bad news and learning how to smile anyway. She hugged Ethan carefully, like she was still afraid he might break, then turned and took Claire's hands. "Thank you for bringing him back to us," she whispered, voice trembling. Claire swallowed hard. "He brought himself back," Claire said. "Atlas just refused to let the world forget." As the chapel doors opened and sunlight spilled across the aisle, Atlas let out one small bark, soft but perfectly timed, and every head turned at once, the sound hanging in the air like a blessing before the room exhaled again. Atlas wasn't asked to walk far. He was guided to a comfortable spot near the front with a padded mat, a small bowl of water, and a blanket folded, like a promise. He settled with a slow sigh, eyes following Claire the way he always had. Claire moved down the aisle with steady steps, feeling the strange weight of joy, how heavy it could be when you'd once believed you didn't deserve it. Ethan stood waiting, hands clasped, shoulders relaxed for the first time in a long time. The vows were simple, because their lives had taught them that simple things last. Claire spoke about choosing each other in ordinary days, not just dramatic ones. Ethan spoke about trust, how it wasn't a feeling, it was a decision made over and over. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, Claire felt her hands shake, and she didn't fight it. She let the moment be human. Atlas lifted his head, blinked slowly, and then, like he was sealing the ceremony in his own language, he padded forward just a step and leaned his weight against Claire's leg. Warm, solid, real. Claire looked down at him, her eyes burning. She bent slightly, just enough for her whisper to land where it belonged. "The snow couldn't bury you," she murmured, voice soft as prayer. "And it couldn't bury us." Ethan heard her anyway. He squeezed her hand, and for a heartbeat, the world felt bright and safe. Not because danger didn't exist, but because love had become stronger than the season that tried to end them. Sometimes people think miracles have to be loud. They imagine thunder, shining lights, or a moment the whole world stops and claps. But many miracles come quietly, the way snow falls, one small moment at a time, until everything changes. A little extra courage, one decision to turn back and check, a faithful animal who refuses to walk away, a stranger who chooses compassion instead of fear. These are the kinds of ordinary things God can use to save a life, heal a heart, and bring two broken stories back into the light. If you're watching this and you've had days where you felt buried by grief, by stress, by loneliness, by the weight of what you can't fix, please hear this. The snow doesn't get the final word. God still writes endings, and sometimes He sends help through the most unexpected messengers. Take a moment and tell me where you're watching from and what you're praying for right now. If this story gave you hope, please share it with someone who needs a little light today. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories that remind us how love, loyalty, and faith can survive any winter. May God bless you and your family, keep you safe, warm your heart, and guide you through whatever season you're in. Amen.